Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material as I attempt in 10 minutes or less, sometimes more, to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can ask me a question however you find. You can send me an email. You can respond to a previous podcast or YouTube video. You can send me a postcard. You can yell out loudly in the street, and hopefully I'll hear it. This is a question, again, a second question from Today Tomic 1943. Thank you, Today, for your second question. And his question, hi Murray, do we know why and when the difference between Hastati, Principes, Triarii ceased to exist in the Republican Roman army? Thanks. Now, you may have seen a couple of questions ago that I said these things are all controversial, and that was talking about the decline or the demise of the hoplite, which I pinpointed to a particular battle in 222 BC. And similarly, this is similar in the sense that it's controversial, but it's non-similar in the sense that what used to be the concrete date for the end of the Hastati, Principes, and Triarii is no longer regarded as a singular date. Now, that date originally is 107 BC, during the period of what were known as the Marian reforms. Now, the Marian reforms, you might know, of course, is when you have Marius's mules, where you've got each individual Roman legionary is a sort of a self-contained soldier, armed the same, whereas in the period of the Middle Republic with Hastati, Principes, and Triarii, they are differently, with spears or pila, and they're different wealth categories. And so what you find, and age categories, wealth and age categories originally, what you find in those reforms is that in fact now those categories are eliminated and Roman legionaries become standardized, and that therefore you can enlist men who don't meet the property qualification, and even those who do just enlisted as Roman legionaries rather than one of the three. Well, in fact, there's six: Velites, Hastati, Principes, Triarii, Rorarii, and Acensi. The poor old Rorarii and Acensi get forgotten. They seem to be the poorest armed troops, similar to the Psiloi in Greek armies. However, what you've then got is the issue that you've now got legionaries, Budoink, and auxiliaries performed by allies. Now, the problem is, of course, that the reforms of Gaius Marius are given to us as a fait accompli made by Marius, by Sallust in his Jugurthine War, and by Plutarch in his Life of Marius. However, what we find is, of course, that those reforms have been part of a process throughout the 2nd century BC as crises of Roman military command have become worse and worse. And one of the reasons for the rise of Marius is that there's a series of calamitous defeats, Arausio and others, by various threats to Rome, and he can take advantage of those and say, I can do what those people can't. And so it makes sense that he reforms the army. Now, the reality probably is that those reforms have been creeping in over time. Probably men who haven't met the strict wealth qualifications have been allowed to serve, even though they don't really admit it. Roman armies have been paid for quite some time, and various Roman authors trace the decline of Rome's greatness from that moment. But chances are that those sorts of reforms have been coming in, whether there's a strict enforcement of the weapon types that we get in the classic description of the Hastati, Principes, and Triarii, hard to know. It's also problematic, and several of our sources are anachronistic, especially Livy. But, they're describing, Livy and Polybius are describing the Second Punic War and earlier, and they're being, I'll say influenced, but tainted's probably a better word, by the later reforms of what they're describing. And so we do find that there are terms that were like, hang on a minute, that's weird. So, for instance, under the Principes, Triarii, and Hastati, what you've actually got is a maniple. So a maniple is roughly 120 men arrayed in 3 ranks of 40, combining velites, hastati, principes, and triarii. And so that's where you've got this 3 lines coming from. Oh, that reminds me, I think I'm answering 2 questions at once here. Oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm sorry. There's another question about the triple acquies. We'll get to that. So the maniple is this whole way of fighting. And again, you'll find histories of Roman armies saying that it exists from 315 down to 107. Boom, 107, it stops. But in our sources, we find that the word cohort is used much, much earlier, right back into the 4th, even the 5th century BC. Problem with that, of course, is that the cohortal way of fighting in a legion, where what you've got is a cohort of 480 men, is so 6 centuries of 80. The problem with that is, how can you have a cohort earlier? Is it the same cohort, or is it one of those annoying things that happens all over the place where the word is the same but the meaning changes? Because we're told that the cohortal form replaces the manipular form, and yet here you have the cohort mentioned as a fighting unit earlier under the manipular fighting style. So it's not as clear cut as people like to make it, and as histories tend to tell us. So what seems to happen in this period is they are now called legionaries. Were they being called legionaries? Like, we don't get descriptions of Hastati, Principes, and Triarii in the battles before Marius, but then the sources of that period are fragmentary and lost. You know, we no longer have Polybius. I think that Livy is fragmentary for that period. So it's tricky and problematic because you've got a lack of sources to tell us. When the sources such as Sallust and Plutarch do credit Marius with this reform, it doesn't seem to be quite as cut and dry. There are sort of hang-ons of more traditional mid-republican warfare right through until the middle, even late 1st century BC. And so, again, the idea that it's a standardized, almost industrial, clean break, as opposed to whatever the commander decides is best, is what your army's doing. And that's true as well, that you know, one of the criticisms of the reforms under Marius, the removal of the wealth classes, is that it makes the Roman armies thereafter loyal to their general, who can get them pay and booty, and not to the state. And certainly the problems of the first civil war between Marius and Sulla, and then the latest civil wars in the 1st century between Pompey and Caesar and thereafter, are partially problematic because the loyalty of the army is to their general, not to the state of Rome. And so in that sense, there is a change, but in other senses, there's not, you know, the good old-fashioned Roman peeler having a wooden peg. I believe that there's now the argument that doesn't exist at all. That the wooden peg is an invention, a literary invention. But when did it come in? It's there and it's not there at various points after this 107 BC thing. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. You can argue it's a transitional period that sort of centers on Caius Marius, but if you throw in the secure date of 107 BC, you'll get into trouble. Join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. You can, of course, back us on Patreon. Go to Patreon/Ancient Warfare Podcast. You can back us at Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. We'll see you again. Thanks. Bye.